September 1939, the Bay Roberts Fishing Wharf, Newfoundland. The salt spray from the choppy North Atlantic slapped against the weathered wooden planks of the wharf. The rhythmic clanging of a single bell buoy offshore was the only sound that broke the lonely silence. Newfoundland, not yet a part of Canada, was a remote British dominion, a place of isolated outports and unforgiving, fog-bound wilderness. The war had just begun in Europe. A distant rumble of artillery and marching boots. But here the tension was a quiet, cold fact, carried on the sea breeze. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter was not a fisherman. He was a highly trained German intelligence officer, operating under the deep cover identity of a Swiss naturalist collecting marine specimens. He stood near the water's edge, his binoculars scanning the horizon not for seabirds, but for the telltale plume of smoke from an approaching Royal Navy cruiser, or more crucially, the shadow of a U-boat making a clandestine rendezvous. Richter was part of a small, scattered network of Abwehr agents operating throughout North America, a network tasked with mapping Allied mobilization and, most importantly, identifying the bottlenecks in the inevitable flow of American war material to Great Britain. Their job was sabotage. But before destruction came observation, and there was one observation point that was paramount. Shrouded in such secrecy it felt like a ghost, the Newfoundland airport. Officially known only to a handful of high-ranking British and Canadian officials, the airfield had been built in the mid-1930s on a swampy plateau near a forgotten railway siding called Gander. It was a massive, improbable project. 4 gigantic concrete runways carved out of the boreal forest designed for a future that hadn't quite arrived. Now that future was the war and the airfield. Now under the control of the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF Station Gander was rapidly becoming the most strategically important yet deeply classified military installation in the Western Hemisphere. Richter's primary contact was a seemingly innocuous meteorologist working near St. John's who intercepted encrypted radio traffic. The messages being decoded were filled with strange cryptic language. Hudson's cleared for departure. Liberators incoming. Beaverbrook Center prep complete. The names meant little, but the quantity was beginning to chill the Germans' resolve. The sheer volume of traffic indicated that the airfield was not merely a base for local reconnaissance patrols. It was a throughput machine. Richter took a deep, salty breath and adjusted the fake spectacles on his nose. He knew Gander existed, but its purpose was still obscured by layers of Allied deception and the sheer distance. He had sent 3 junior assets toward the Gander area, mostly simple German sympathizers, recruited from the local population, given rudimentary training in radio signaling and counting. 2 had failed to return, likely lost to the unforgiving wilderness, or worse, intercepted by the vigilant Canadian Army units guarding the perimeter. Then, in early November 1940, the first concrete, terrifying report arrived. It was scrawled on thin paper, smuggled via a fishing vessel to a neutral contact in Boston, then routed back through South America to the Abwehr High Command in Berlin. The source: an elderly Newfoundlander named the Coot, who worked on the railway line near Gander Lake, was unreliable but persistent. The report described an unnatural phenomenon: 7 massive twin-engine bombers, later confirmed to be Lockheed Hudsons, lined up on the massive Gander tarmac, not dismantled and packed in crates, but fully assembled, fueled, and manned by an extraordinary collection of civilians and military pilots. They had taken off heading directly east, straight into the teeth of the unforgiving, unpredictable North Atlantic winter. The implication hit Richter like a physical blow. They weren't shipping the planes. They were flying them. They were bypassing the boat-infested shipping lanes, skipping the weeks of vulnerability in the holds of cargo vessels and delivering operational bombers directly to the beleaguered Royal Air Force, RAF. In Britain, this was the birth of the RAF Ferry Command, and Gander was its cradle. Richter knew the logistical nightmare of such an endeavor. The North Atlantic route was lethal, beset by storms, ice, and impossible navigation over open water. It was a route that Hitler's strategists had written off as commercially unfeasible and militarily absurd. Yet the report proved it was happening. If 7 could make it, how many more would follow? Richter quickly prepared his own, most alarming intelligence summation to be forwarded to his handlers. A message wrapped in a code, so thick it would take weeks to reach Berlin. The American assembly line has circumvented the ocean. A new airbridge is open. Newfoundland is the critical nexus. Summer 1940 falls. Abwehr headquarters Berlin and Gander, Newfoundland. In the stark echoing halls of the Abwehr in Berlin, Colonel Ulrich Schmidt, a senior analyst, read the translated reports trickling in from North America. He was disturbed. The initial report on the 7 Lockheed Hudsons that successfully crossed the Atlantic in November 1940 was initially dismissed as a fluke, a desperate time propaganda stunt by the beleaguered British. But the subsequent intelligence filtering through from Richter's network suggested the fluke was becoming doctrine. The latest intelligence from an informant in Montreal detailed the furious round, the clock efforts of a massive yet multinational undertaking. RAF Ferry Command. The organization headquartered in Montreal was aggressively recruiting civilian pilots, navigators, and radio operators from across the Commonwealth and the still neutral United States. Their sole purpose to maintain this improbable aerial bridge. Schmidt leaned over the vastly detailed map of the Atlantic. The traditional shipping lanes were clearly marked, crisscrossed by red lines indicating known patrol zones, the very zones where Grand Admiral Deere, Nitz's wolf packs, were currently savaging Allied convoys. But the new air route, the Great Circle route, offered a chilling alternative. By staging through Gander, the distance was cut dramatically, making the crossing feasible for twin engine bombers that lacked the range for a non-stop flight from mainland North America. The true logistical nightmare, however, was the sheer scale of the American industrial output. By mid-1941, the United States was rapidly transitioning into the arsenal of democracy. New aircraft, B-24 Liberators, Boston's Hudsons, and P-51 Mustangs were rolling off assembly lines in California and Texas with relentless speed. The intelligence reports now detailed how these aircraft were being flown fresh from the factories across the continent to Canada. But it was Gander that remained the critical, terrifying choke point. The new reports, now more frequent and utilizing more sophisticated codes, described a scene of manic, impossible activity. Gander, once a desolate swamp in Newfoundland, was rapidly morphing into what Allied personnel were starting to call the crossroads of the world. Squadron leader David McLean, a weather-beaten Canadian pilot working for Ferry Commander at Gander, experienced this chaos firsthand. He stood on the vast tarmac, the smell of high-octane fuel thick in the air. The runways were never empty. 1 hour, they were marshalling a squadron of Hudson light bombers. their fuselages still gleaming with factory paint. The next a flight of massive 4-engine B-24 Liberators lumbered in from the west, their crews exhausted after crossing the entire continent. The roar of Pratt and Whitney engines was constant. McLean squinted up at a towering hangar, part of the massive expansion that saw American construction crews working side by side with Canadian and Newfoundland civilians. The base now boasted several thousand personnel, pilots, mechanics, meteorologists, and communication specialists working 24 hours a day. The entire infrastructure was dedicated to one single goal: keeping the flow moving. The weather crews, using Gander's strategic location, were providing the vital minute-by-minute meteorological updates necessary to launch aircraft safely into the North Atlantic, a deadly maze of unpredictable cold fronts and high winds. Meanwhile, Richter's new asset, a civilian cook named the Spoon, working in the sprawling, crowded mess halls of Gander, risked his life to count the flow. He didn't need blueprints. He just needed to look out the window. His last report, painstakingly transmitted, contained the chilling truth that ultimately reached Colonel Schmidt's desk. The movement is not a trickle. It is a flood, sometimes 30, 40 aircraft in a single day. The runway is never empty. The production appears endless. Schmidt realized that the initial assessment of Gander as a vulnerable forward operating base was fundamentally flawed. It wasn't a military base in the traditional sense. It was a logistical machine, a transatlantic launching pad shielded by the deep winter and the sheer distance of the North Atlantic. If the Germans couldn't sink the planes at sea, and they couldn't bomb the factories in California, their only hope was to neutralize this crucial intermediary point. But how? Gander was guarded by Canadian infantry regiments, and the surrounding wilderness was impenetrable. Any conventional naval or air strike was impossible without sustaining crippling losses. Colonel Schmidt crumpled the coded report in his fist. He was a professional. He dealt in facts, not despair. But the facts painted a grim picture. The intelligence confirmed that the Allies had found the perfect antidote to the U-boat war. The sheer terrifying volume of American industrial power, now efficiently airborne, had nullified the advantage Germany had gained in the Battle of the Atlantic. For the first time, a dark, cold realization settled over him, one that transcended tactical losses and focused on strategic doom. The sheer, inexhaustible power of the arsenal of democracy was unstoppable, and Gander was the funnel through which it was being poured directly onto the battlefields of Europe. Spring 1943, the atmosphere in the intelligence briefing room was frigid, matching the bitter winter outside. Colonel Schmidt was now reporting to a skeptical high command, presenting his findings not just on the volume of aircraft, but on the deeper, more chilling logistical reality of Gander. He used a simple graph, stark black ink on white paper, to illustrate his point. One line charted U-boat sinkings, the other aircraft deliveries via Ferry Command. While the U-boats inflicted horrific losses on convoys of slower merchant ships, the flow of bombers was exponentially faster and safer. The Lockheed Hudson that took weeks to build and ship by sea could now be flown across the Atlantic in under 10 hours, bypassing the wolf packs entirely. "Gentlemen," Schmidt stated, tapping the Gander section of his map, "our enemy is not only Great Britain, our enemy is North American production. And this base, this RCAF Station Gander, is the bypass valve." He detailed the statistics gathered at immense risk by agents like Richter and the Spoon. By the close of 1941, thousands of aircraft, including the first of the massive consolidated B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, had already passed through Gander and landed safely in Prestwick, Scotland. This was a continuous aerial pipeline, and the speed of the aircraft delivery meant the British were getting planes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down over the channel. The generals around the table understood the implications of air superiority, but they struggled to grasp the scale of the North American economy. Surely the Atlantic weather defeats them in winter, one admiral challenged, referring to the well-known ferocity of the winter gales that tore through the region. It slows them, yes, Schmidt conceded, but it does not stop them. The Canadians and the Americans have built Gander into the finest meteorological station in the world. Their weather crews, often young Newfoundland civilians who know the North Atlantic intimately, predict the tiny windows of safe passage. They gamble and they win. The aircraft often depart Gander with only a few hours' margin, flying high above the weather systems that would turn a U-boat captain's stomach. Schmidt paused, his eyes sweeping the room. The true calculation is this: we are fighting a war of attrition in the air. But the enemy's replacement rate is functionally infinite. Every 3 days, the Allies can replace the entire loss of the Battle of Britain simply through this airbridge. Our U-boat campaign is a tourniquet on an artery that is now being entirely bypassed. The Abwehr had explored sabotage. They analyzed parachuting agents near Gander Lake, infiltrating the sprawling temporary barracks, or even a daring seaborne raid against the base's vulnerable fuel supplies. All options were dismissed as impossible. The perimeter was too vast, the Canadian patrols too effective, and the lack of reliable cover in the subarctic spruce forest made any large-scale operation suicidal. The final piece of intelligence, arguably the most devastating, came in the spring of 1942 as the Ferry Command ramped up operations for the flying season. The report confirmed the delivery of the 4 engine giants, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These were not merely coastal patrol aircraft. They were the weapons of strategic bombing capable of reaching the industrial heartlands of Germany. Klaus Richter, still operating in the shadows of Newfoundland, realized the moment he compiled the confirmed figures. Germany was now not just losing the Battle of the Atlantic. It was facing a future where its own cities would be reduced to ash by bombers delivered weekly through this impossible Canadian air hub. The intelligence was blunt, unromantic, and devastatingly accurate. The sheer, overwhelming volume of North American industrial capacity funneled through the Gander air bridge made German victory in the long term impossible. When Colonel Schmidt delivered his final assessment that the Allies had achieved a reliable industrial scale method for transferring strategic air power directly to Britain, effectively nullifying the U-boat war's strategic effect on aircraft supply, the German High Command had no choice but to accept the cold calculus of defeat. The air war would now favor the Allies decisively thanks to this secret base in the unforgiving Canadian wilderness. 1943. RCAF Station Gander, Newfoundland. The years marched on, measured not in seasons, but in the relentless mechanical roar of departing engines. By 1943, RCAF Station Gander was a staggering city unto itself. It was the largest airfield in the world by land area, boasting 4 colossal runways that rarely saw a moment of quiet. What began with 7 small Hudson bombers had swelled into a torrent of metal, fuel, and manpower, solidifying Gander's nickname, the crossroads of the world. The Canadian military presence had reached its peak, integrating with American ground crews and thousands of Newfoundlander civilians who kept the massive logistical machine running. The RAF Ferry Command, later absorbed into the Royal Air Force Transport Command, was now a polished, high-volume operation. They weren't just flying B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses. They were flying every type of aircraft the Allies needed, from nimble P-51 Mustang fighters fitted with temporary ferry fuel tanks to multi-engine transports carrying critical personnel and high-value cargo. Pilot Officer Jean-Pierre Dubois, a young French-Canadian pilot flying a newly built B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, stood in the Gander briefing room. The energy was electric, a dizzying blend of adrenaline and exhaustion. On the walls, meteorological charts showed the typical treacherous North Atlantic weather, the cumulonimbus thunderheads, the icing conditions, the shifting winds. But McLean and the other Ferry Command veterans had refined the art of the transatlantic hop to an industrial science. Dubois listened intently as the weather officer gave the rote briefing. A high-altitude passage known as the Blue Yonder route, designed to punch through the weather and avoid German U-boats, which now knew to watch for air traffic. We have 32 aircraft departing in 3 waves over the next 6 hours, the officer stated, including a flight of 6 Lockheed Venturas right before you. Maintain strict radio silence after the coast. 32 aircraft in 1 day. You realize the scale of this. Every few hours, Gander was launching the equivalent of a small air force delivered directly to the doorstep of the collapsing German air defense. For the German command, the intelligence from the dwindling and an increasingly isolated network in North America was now a source of deep, demoralizing resignation. Colonel Schmidt, having been transferred to an administrative role after his accurate but politically inconvenient predictions, still monitored the Ferry Command metrics. The total number of aircraft delivered by the end of 1943 would exceed 10,000. This staggering, impossible number, 10,000 aircraft flown across the deadly ocean, represented more than just metal and horsepower. It was the physical manifestation of the strategic doom he had foreseen. It confirmed that Adolf Hitler's fundamental miscalculation was believing the Western powers lacked the industrial will or the logistical ability to deploy their full economic might. The Gander airfield, built into the very edge of the North American continent, had nullified the most devastating weapon of the U-boat war against Allied supply lines. It secured British air superiority, fueled the combined bomber offensive, and guaranteed the eventual Allied invasion of Europe. As Pilot Officer Dubois strapped into the cold metal seat of his B-25 Mitchell, the heavy bomber vibrated with power. Looking out over the Gander tarmac, he didn't just see runways and barracks. He saw an unending ribbon of American production that stretched back across the entire continent. His bomber, just one of thousands, represented a cold, hard fact the German generals had to live with. The war was already lost. The cockpit canopy closed, muffling the chaotic sounds of the ramp. With a final salute from the ground crew, Dubois pushed the throttles forward. The Mitchell raced down the runway, gathered speed, and lifted into the cold, vast expanse of the North Atlantic sky, carrying its destructive payload, and more importantly, carrying the inevitable reality of Allied victory directly to Europe. The roar of its engines was the final inescapable proof that the Third Reich could not win a war of attrition against an enemy whose industrial strength could build a bridge of steel over the impossible Atlantic. If the incredible untold story of Gander and the impossible airbridge stunned you, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell. This Canadian secret fundamentally altered the course of World War II. What are your thoughts? Which specific bomber or fighter do you think was the most critical to the success of the Ferry Command? Let us know in the comments below.